Well, now that we've finally figured out that Trump wants us focused on everything but Project 2025, let's get back to what really matters in this election. And it is not whether Kamala Harris recently turned black, as Trump foolishly alleged. What really matters is policies, specifically Project 2025 policies. And in this video, I will show you that Project 2025 education policies will reverse decades of academic and equity progress in the education system. These policies will harm African American kids particularly. You don't want to miss this. So stay tuned and I'll tell you all about it. Hello and welcome everybody. I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. And each and every week we bring you at least one video regarding some story concerning politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy an unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If that interests you, and I certainly hope it does, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll get notification every time we upload one of these powerful and informative videos. All right. So this is what we're going to get into today. It is going to be very, very, very powerful. But before we start, I want to encourage you to go to Amazon.com, grab a copy of my book, Education and Justice, especially since I'm doing this video and this book addresses many of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video. Also, if you have a son who is in public schools, but he's reading below grade level, go to our website, lljp.org, and register him for our summer reading program, something we call BARS, which stands for Black America Reading Strongly. All right? Hey everyone, I am attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Recently, I took a look at our analytics and I noticed something shocking. Many of you watch our videos, and I believe you enjoy them, but you haven't subscribed yet. What are you waiting for? Again, I was shocked because I know our content is empowering and informative. Plus, our 2024 goal is to have 150,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Please help us by hitting that subscribe button, especially you young folks. We particularly want to increase our number of young subscribers. Thanks for all your continued support. We appreciate it very much. Now, before we get started, I want to tell you this. This video is not a short reaction type video, nor is it a 2-hour video about foolishness. It's a longer video than normal. However, it is about something extremely important, as I said in the beginning. And that's because I'm going to go over how Project 2025 intends to do some very bad things with education, with the public education system. So if you have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, godchildren, etc. in public schools, please watch this video from start to finish. In fact, what I suggest is that you watch it with others and make it sort of a group discussion. All right? So discipline yourself to watch this video throughout the duration of this video until the very conclusion, because I'm going to go through some extremely important stuff as it relates to education. If Donald Trump gets back in office, he will surely implement the policies in Project 2025, and it will forever change our country. And what I'm telling you today is how it will change the education system of our country. All right, so let's go to another screen and let's get started. All right, so yes, the title page here, Project 2025, education policies are hateful towards black kids. And I mean that, they really are. Now, the purpose for this video is to warn you about a threat facing black children. It's not to frighten you. It's not to leave you hopeless. It is to motivate you to vote, to organize registration, voter registration groups, to do everything we got to do to keep Donald Trump out of office. Because with Trump comes Project 2025 and these policies that I'm going to share with you. Now, what I'm going to share with you was written by a MAGA member who is dedicated to returning our education system to an era before the Brown versus the Board of Education case. And that was not a good era. That was during the Plessy v. Ferguson case, something that we call separate but equal, really separate and unequal is what it should have been called. We don't want to go back to that. Okay? Now, let's start out with a definition on systemic racism. A lot of people confuse systemic racism with individual racism, and they are very, very, very different. And the impact of them are extremely different as well. So when we talk about the education system, we're talking about systemic racism. We're not necessarily talking about individual racists like Trump. We're talking about the systems of racism that people like Trump, MAGA, the GOP, and others have created and they defend. Now, what is systemic racism specifically? Systemic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, policies, practices, ideals, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people while denying these same resources, rights, and power to people of color. Let's read it again. Systemic racism today is composed of intersecting, overlapping, and codependent racist institutions, like the education system, that's an institution. The healthcare system, that's an institution. And these institutions have policies, practices, ideals, and behaviors that give an unjust amount of resources, rights, and power to white people. So the education system, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, they have policies and practices, behaviors in place that favor and uplift the white community, and conversely, they oppress and essentially destroy, in many ways, the African American community. So it's really the systems and institutions and the practices and policies of those systems and institutions that are the real problem. Meeting some Karen out here who calls you a bad name, a racial slur, that, yes, is personally offensive, but it's nowhere near as detrimental as systemic racism. Because you can have real nice people involved in a systemically racist system that is doing you much more harm than, say, some Karen out here that you'll probably never meet again. But when you go to the bank, when you are in school, when you go to the hospital, and there are practices and policies, behaviors, certain ways of thinking in those institutions that target African Americans with racial discrimination, that's the real problem. And that is what we're dealing with when we talk about the education system. All right. Now let's go back over to our screen here. The education policies of Project 2025 have hateful goals. So what are the goals? What do they intend to accomplish if Trump gets back in office? And by the way, all of this is coming straight out of the Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership, that 900-page policy manual. Every bit of what I'm going to show you. I'm not making this up. I didn't create it. I didn't write it. No liberal, no progressive, no Democrat wrote this manual. This was written by Trump officials and other MAGA members. So don't let anybody tell you that this is a Democratic scare tactic. That makes no sense when it was written by MAGA, Trump, GOP supporters. This is real. All right. So this says the education policies in Project 2025 will redirect federal funds to predominantly white school districts that are already better funded, starving predominantly black school districts of much needed resources. Such policies will revert our education system back to a pre-Brown versus Board of Education era and dismantle decades of progress toward education equity and inclusivity. To accomplish its goals, Project 2025 champions dismantling the Department of Education so that it can redirect education funding and gut equity requirements. So that is the goal of Project 2025 education policies. They want the money that the Department of Education controls redirected to predominantly white school districts. And that will do what? Starve predominantly black school districts of much needed funds. There's already a funding gap between white school districts and black school districts. Well, if Trump gets in office, Project 2025 will completely dismantle the Department of Education and send those funds primarily to white school districts. That's bad. That's horrible. Because again, black school districts already suffer from an academic funding gap, an education funding gap. We already suffer from that. And so to take what dollars the Department of Education gives to predominantly black school districts and send that money to school districts that are already better funded because of higher property taxes, that's really bad for our children. But those are the goals of Project 2025. Now, this section of the Mandate for Leadership, the Project 2025 manual, was written by Lindsay M. Burke, who is the director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is the think tank that created Project 2025. So this woman here is a director over the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. She served on Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin's Transition Steering Committee and Landing Team for Education. She serves on the Board of Visitors for George Mason University, the Board of Education Freedom Institute, and the Advisory Board of the Independent Women's Forum's Education Freedom Center. All right, so again, the point I'm making here by reading a bit of her bio is to stress that this is not written by Democrats, progressives, liberals. No, this is written by MAGA members. This is what they intend to accomplish if Trump is reelected. So yes, Project 2025 will dismantle the Department of Education. Federal education policy should be limited, and ultimately, the Federal Department of Education should be eliminated. That's page 319. On page 349, Dr. Burke wrote, setting education policy on the right track long-term would require sunsetting the U.S. Department of Education altogether. So in her article here, which is in that manual, twice at least, she said their intention is to dismantle the Department of Education. Now that is, again, very problematic, and here's why. Many of the programs in the Department of Education were created to provide equity in education. And that has never set well with white conservatives, aka white supremacists. They have resented the Department of Education since then. Now let me tell you what I mean, and we're going to see here in just a moment. In many ways, the Department of Education was put in place to help African American students. And whites never liked it, just like they don't like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, because what does it do? It protects African Americans, by and large, from environmental racism. So anything that intends to help to lift African American people, white conservatives, aka white supremacists, they don't like it. And so they have set their sights on dismantling the Department of Education as well as the EPA. So this is not good for blacks that the Department of Education would be dismantled if MAGA and Project 2025 and Trump gets their way. Now, let me share with you some history of the Department of Education, and then you'll see why the Department of Education has been favorable for black children. For most of our history, the federal government played a minor role in education. Now, this is page 320 of this manual. Then, over a 14-month period beginning in 1964, Congress planted the seeds for what would become the U.S. Department of Education, ED, or the department. In July of that year, watch this, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after Congress reached a consensus that the mistreatment of Black Americans was no longer tolerable and merited a federal response. Now, she's not writing this in a way that celebrates the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's not the tone of this. She's writing this from the standpoint of this has been a nuisance. All right, that's what she's saying. In the case of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, ESEA, and the Higher Education Act of 1965, HEA, Congress sought to improve education outcomes for disadvantaged students by providing additional compensatory funding for low-income children and lower-income college students. Again, this is page 320, and she is not celebrating this. She is essentially saying the tone of this has been a nuisance. Watch this. Spending on ESEA and the HEA, part of Johnson's war on poverty, grew exponentially in the years that followed. So now she's about to start complaining about what Lyndon Johnson did in the 60s. And oh, by the way, I got to tell you this. Black conservatives love to belittle Lyndon Johnson. They don't want you thinking that Lyndon Johnson and Democrats generally have done anything for the African American community. And yet it has been the Democratic Party, at least for the last 75, 80 years, that have championed civil rights advancement. But they really, really love to attack Lyndon Johnson. They just simply don't like the man. Because if you look at what Lyndon Johnson did when he was president by signing into law the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, essentially you would have to give him credit for breaking the back of Jim Crow. And they don't want you thinking the Democrats have done anything. That is both black conservatives, white conservatives, and even some of these black YouTube, what I call pro-black imposters. They too try to play down and will tell you the Democrats ain't done nothing for black people. Yet it is the very policies of the Democratic Party over the last 75 years. And I know some of you will say, well, it was the Democrats who enslaved blacks. You're right. Those were the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party. They left after the Southern strategy took full control of the GOP, and those Dixiecrats out of the Democratic Party went into the GOP party. And the progressives in the GOP party or the Republican Party transferred into the Democratic Party. That's why I keep saying the Democratic Party over the last 75 to 100 years. If you look at nearly all the major civil rights laws and advancements over that 75 to 100 year period, they were all sponsored by Democrats. Every single one of them. Every one of them. And who opposed them? The GOP. All right, so she is here basically expressing her dismay and displeasure with these Johnson policies, this war on poverty, for example. So she says by fiscal year 2022, ESEA programs received $27.7 billion in appropriations, in addition to $190 billion that came through the pandemic's elementary and secondary schools emergency relief funds, which relied on ESEA formulas. The same year, the department spent more than $2 billion just to administer Title IV of the HEA, which authorizes federal student loans and Pell Grants. It provided $22.5 billion in Pell Grants, and it oversaw outlays of close to $100 billion in direct student loans. This is page 321 of the manual. Now, let me say something about Pell Grants. I went to college. I graduated from college because of Pell Grants. I basically was able to get a free education because of Pell Grants. My family could not afford to send me to college. So from me working a bunch of jobs during college and the Pell Grants that I received, I was able to leave the tobacco fields of North Carolina to go to college. And all that came about as the result of the legislation that Lyndon Johnson signed into law. So what she's doing here is complaining that the Department of Education spends a lot of money. And once again, a lot of that money goes toward creating equity, fairness, equality for African American students. And she, along with the other white conservatives, white supremacists, GOP, Project 2025, MAGA members, they resent that. So she's basically making the case for getting rid of the Department of Education so the money can go elsewhere instead of going toward trying to do anything to uplift black kids. She goes on to say, since 1965, Congress has continued to layer on dozens of new laws and programs as federal solutions to myriad education problems. In 1973, it passed the Rehabilitation Act, and in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to address educational neglect of students with disabilities. Well, what's wrong with that? You see, she's complaining about all of this. What's wrong with passing laws to try to help students with disadvantages like disabilities? That is a good thing. You see, their way of thinking is, here's how they think. They want this money primarily going to the richest of the rich. I read an article recently that said that there has been a huge wealth transfer in the last several decades from working class people to the ultra rich. Working class people have gotten poor and the ultra rich have gotten much, much wealthier. And so it is really dubious to hear these people complain about spending some money to try to help the least of them, to try to help the most vulnerable of them, while at the same time they're giving $2, $3, $4 trillion tax cuts to the most wealthiest. So they want to starve the education department, which will hurt the most vulnerable in our country. That's what they want to do. They want to starve it to death so that it dies. And meanwhile, sort of redirecting that money to white students, white school districts. All right, stay with me. So now that she has laid out her argument for why the Department of Education, or at least part of her argument for why the Department of Education should no longer be in existence, that it should be sunsetted, that it should be dismantled, she then begins to talk about reforms that should be made immediately upon Trump's election. Now, that's the thing I want you to understand. If Donald Trump wins, he does not come into the office with just his family. He comes into the office with that manual under his arm and a whole bunch of white conservatives that he's going to hire and he's going to put into these positions. He's going to fire, according to Project 2025, he's going to fire a bunch of the folks who are working there now. Some of them, quite a few of them, are black people because, after all, D.C., the District of Columbia, has a whole lot of African Americans, and many of them work those government jobs. So Project 2025 intends to get rid of them and replace them with what Project 2025 calls Mr. and Mrs. Smith from the heartland of America, from rural parts of America. In other words, white conservatives. And put those people in those positions, and then we'll see just how the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, and so on begins to act very hostile toward issues of justice and equity and diversity and inclusivity and so on. You follow me? All right, so some of the reforms that she is advocating is, let's look at the first one, advance education freedom. Now, I want you to pay close attention to what I'm about to read. Empowering families to choose among a diverse set of education opinions is key to reform and improved outcomes, and it can be achieved without establishing a new federal program. For example, portability of existing federal education spending to fund families directly or allowing federal tax credits to encourage voluntary contributions to K through 12 education savings accounts managed by charitable nonprofits could significantly advance education choice. That's page 322. What is she saying? She's saying, as I told you in the beginning, redirect funds from the Department of Education directly to families, white families. Let's be straight up. Very few African-American families will get these funds. If she thought that African-American families would get these funds, she would not be advocating for this type of reform. You see, again, these folks have hated efforts by the Department of Education to try to lift black students. And that has been a big part of the Department of Education's mission ever since President Jimmy Carter helped develop the current day Department of Education. And they've resented it. We're basically fighting a fight that never ended, to be honest with you. We have been fighting this fight throughout slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow. It has never relented. We go from Reconstruction to redemption. Reconstruction is when we, after slavery, began to make some progress. But that was short-lived because redemption arose where white Southerners began to implement Jim Crow laws and codes and so forth. So we've gone back and forth, back and forth. During the Obama administration, you could say it was somewhat of a reconstruction period. But then what happened? Trump happened because he was their answer to Obama. And so then we started going through another redemption period. And that period, they're trying to extend that period. They're trying to codify and institutionalize Trumpism. All his bombast, all his white supremacy, all his hatred, his racism, they want that written into the law. They want that embedded in the federal government, you see, in the education systems. So that's why we got to fight this. And we fight this, as I said earlier, by voting, by keeping Trump and Project 2025 out of office. And right now, that means voting for Kamala Harris. All right, let's go back. So here's another reform effort that I want to read to you, and you'll see exactly how these policies are hateful to black kids. Restore state and local control over education funding, as I just explained. As Washington begins to downsize its intervention in education, existing funding should be sent to states as grants over which they have full control, enabling states to put federal funding toward any lawful education purpose under state law. Page 322. So just as I explained, that is a huge part of what they want to do. They champion what's called states' rights. And we have always had an issue with states' rights as African Americans because that put us under the thumb, oftentimes, of racist, bigoted, white supremacist people who advocated policies to harm us. And quite often, the only way that we could get any relief, any justice, was looking toward the federal government. So they have been just very anxious, at least since the Brown versus Board of Education case, to get the federal government out of education policy and use that money to help already wealthy, white, predominantly white school districts. And it really, really concerns me, as it should you as well. Let's go back to the screen here so that I can continue showing you why these policies are very harmful and hateful to black kids. Eliminate student loan forgiveness. Taxpayers should expect their investments in higher education to generate economic productivity. When the federal government lends money to individuals for a post-secondary education, taxpayers should expect those borrowers to repay. So basically, again, do nothing to help working people who most often have to take out loans to get a college education. But this crowd of people, all they're concerned about are the richest of the rich, who is bankrolling most of these conservatives. We saw that with Clarence Thomas, who has made millions of dollars sitting on the court championing the causes and grievances of white conservatives. So no student loan forgiveness, but again, a $2 trillion tax cut to the richest of the rich, that's okay. That's fine. And some of you all are young and you don't understand where that thinking comes from. Well, this thinking is called trickle-down economics. And it took root back during the Reagan administration. And incidentally, it was the Heritage Foundation, the same group that developed Project 2025, that developed a whole lot of those Reagan policies. So they want those policies to continue enriching the richest and impoverishing the poorest, the working people. All right, so no student loan forgiveness, but Trump definitely will give his rich buddies and himself lots of tax breaks. What else? Stop enforcing civil rights laws to help black students. All right, enforcement of civil rights should be based on a proper understanding of those laws, rejecting gender ideology and critical race theory. Now, they have demonized critical race theory. They have demonized it. They co-opted the term and made it sound like the worst thing since the earth was made. And it's not. This video is not about critical race theory. Otherwise, I will give you some rundown on critical race theory. But let's just say critical race theory started in law schools primarily. The late Professor Derek Bell is sort of the creator and father of critical race theory that simply asks questions about why do we continue to see the disparities and the discrimination and the results in the African American community if we've made all these strides. Why is the system still mistreating, discriminating against African Americans? That's what critical race theory does. And it then just offers some answers to that very question. Like, for example, America is systemically racist. That is one of the proponents of critical race theory, which is, if you're being honest, is undeniable. But anyway, she says here, to enforce civil rights should be done on a proper understanding of civil rights laws. That means this whole colorblind thing that they developed, this whole reverse discrimination thing that they talk about all the time. In other words, it's civil rights from a white perspective, that only white people are being done wrong. So it's that type of civil rights enforcement. Shameful. So the laws that are in place to protect African American children in these schools, she's advocating that we stop enforcing those civil rights laws the way the Biden administration, the Obama administration, and other Democratic administrations have interpreted and enforced those civil rights laws. Send Title I funds to states rather than low-income schools. She keeps saying this over and over and over again, and so therefore that's why we keep reading about it. So on page 325, Dr. Burke says, transfer Title I Part A, which provides federal funding for lower income school districts, to the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Administration for Children and Families. It should be administered as a no strings attached formula block grant. So Title I funds that tries to equalize low-income school districts that serve a lot of African-American children, those funds should now be retargeted, redirected away from those schools. I mean, this is sinister. And they're very open about it. So if Trump gets elected, this is what they're going to do. They're going to start taking money away from your children's school district and start sending it as block grants back to states. And with no conditions. Use the money however you want to use it, school districts. And Ron DeSantis, use the money however you want to use it. Greg Abbott, use the money however you want to use it. Mark Robinson, if he's elected, use the money however you want to use it. And we know that's not going to be to the advantage of African American students. She also advocates sending IDEA funds to states rather than low-income schools. Most IDEA funding should be converted into a no-strings formula block grant targeted at students with disabilities and distributed directly to local education agencies by Health and Human Services Administration for community living. So, I mean, repeatedly, they're saying dismantle the Department of Education and send the money back to the states. Send the money to Greg Abbott. Send the money to Ron DeSantis. So they can do whatever they want to do with it. And by the way, Texas already has a despicable record for the way it treats children. This state I live in, has the highest, the last I read, the highest level of uninsured children in the country. So take the Department of Education funding and sending it to these states is a horrible idea. Now, school discipline. School discipline. This is an area where we see a lot of discrimination. We see a lot of discrimination in the area of school discipline. It is the reason why African American students, especially African American male students, are disproportionately suspended, expelled, and just basically kicked out of school. And I know this personally because I am a high school dropout. I didn't make it beyond the 10th grade. And in the high school that I went to, back in the late 70s, the principal and assistant principal, the assistant principal, by the way, was an African-American man who apologized to me later. They basically, their goal was to just basically get rid of all the black guys. So nearly every black dude in my community dropped out of high school. Very, very few of us graduated. I didn't graduate, I got a GED. The rest of them, many of them, never went beyond the 8th or 9th grade. And this was, again, in the late 70s. And that was because of the just terrible disciplinary policies of the school district. The particular principal that we had, his name was Rick Denning. I believe his last name was Denning. He was unjustifiably tough on black male students. Didn't try to do anything whatsoever to help us graduate high school. Just kick us out, kick us out, kick us out, kick us out. So the school discipline issue is something I write about in my book a lot because I know, as a former teacher, how school districts get rid of young black males, especially with these heavy-handed school discipline policies. All right, so let's look at what she says. All right, Project 2025's Nefarious Plan for School Discipline. Assuring a safe and orderly school environment should be a primary consideration for school leaders and district administrators. Unfortunately, federal overreach has pushed many school leaders to prioritize the pursuit of racial parity in school discipline indicators, such as detentions, suspensions, and expulsions, over student safety. In 2024, the Obama administration issued a Dear Colleague letter that muddied the standards for civil rights enforcement under Title VI for student discipline cases, page 334. So what is she saying? She's saying that the Obama administration issued a letter encouraging schools to be fair in their school discipline policies. Because, as I write in my book, there are many, 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 many schools that implement school discipline policies that disproportionately result in African American students being suspended over and over and over again. And when that happens, you're going to cause those kids to drop out. You're basically pushing them out. And the Obama administration knew this was going on, as do any of us in this space. And the Obama administration wrote a letter and essentially encouraged schools to be fair. Try to find some alternatives. Don't kick those young men out because essentially you're putting them on the school to prison pipeline. You're putting them in a situation where they're going to end up in the streets and themselves become victims of crime and violence, or they're going to victimize others. So the better thing to do is to try to find alternatives to constant suspensions and expulsions and so on. So we thank former President Obama for doing his best to try to help schools look at it from a different perspective. And as we see here, Project 2025 sees all of that as a nuisance. And they intend to go into office and do away with it all. Now, what happened is, before I move on, what happened is when Trump got elected in 2016, he basically overturned and repealed and deleted a whole lot of the stuff that Obama did. But then Biden got elected, and so Trump is going to go in office and try to get rid of all the civil rights stuff and all of the encouragement from the Biden administration to try to work with these black kids rather than kicking them out of school. So that's why we cannot allow to let Trump and Project 2025 and the GOP back into office. We got to vote. I don't want you to feel hopeless and helpless, because ultimately we got the power. And how do you know? Let me show you how we know we got the power. Because Trump is always trying to mislead us, trying to get us to vote for him or not to vote at all. He focuses on the African American community, because oftentimes it is African Americans in these battleground states like Georgia and Michigan, Detroit and Atlanta and places like that, that if he can get, with the help of black conservatives, if he can get those folks there in Atlanta, those black folks in Atlanta, in Detroit, if he can get them to hate the Democrats, therefore not voting, if they can get them to hate Kamala, she's not black, she just turned black, she sent a lot of black men to prison. If they can get blacks in those areas thinking that and staying away from the polls, then they will be able to more likely get elected again to then turn around and harm black people. All right? Let's read this. OCR, that is the Office of Civil Rights, leveraged federal civil rights investigations as policy enforcement tools. These investigations could only end when school districts agreed to adopt lenient discipline policies, commonly known as restorative justice. Academic studies, as well as students and teacher surveys, suggest that academics and school climate have been harmed substantially by this push. That is crap. These policies of the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, to try to get these schools to be fair, to be equitable, to be compassionate with African American students, they don't make the school environment less safe. They don't make the school environment less productive to academic excellence. No, they help save the lives of some of these children. They help keep some of these kids in school. What do you expect from a kid who, again, is living in a home where the father is not involved, where the mother's having to work a couple jobs, can't be home with the kids, and so the kids are exposed to all sorts of things? You see, the average white kid doesn't go through this. And where does all this stuff come from that we see plaguing the black community? It comes from a legacy of racial oppression. It comes from 250 years of slavery. And then Jim Crow that just ended about 65 years ago. That's where it comes from. Our community has been damaged and harmed by 400 years of white supremacy and racial oppression. And we live amongst a people, white conservatives, white supremacy, who want to take no responsibility for that and who don't want to do anything to try and help correct that, namely with reparations. No, they just say there's something innately wrong about black people and black culture, etc. So she casts aspersions. So she speaks bad about efforts to try to help these young men and young women in school. She says it's been bad for schools. So they want to get rid of all of this. The very programs that the Department of Education implemented to help our students, our children, they will get rid of them. And can you imagine then, some of these programs are saving some people. Well, they won't be there to save any of our children if Trump gets back in office. Then there's the special education part. Do you not know that special education has a disproportionate percentage of black students, black males in particular? And then if you contrast special education with gifted education, you got to search long and hard to find black students, especially black males, in gifted education. So you have a whole lot of black males in special education and very, very, very few in gifted education. Why is that? Because of what I explained to you from the beginning, systemic racism and the legacy of racial oppression that we're talking about. It is not because African Americans have some sort of inferior intellectual or psychological or mental gene. That's not the issue at all. Not at all. There are some nefarious discriminatory practices that occur in society, in this country, in the classroom, in the neighborhood, on the job, that results in more African American students, males especially, being placed in special education. Sometimes what's merely behavioral issues will cause a child to be placed in special education. And it's not that the kid has a mental issue. The kid's behavior is not what it should be. That doesn't mean the kid should be placed in special education. Now, let me say this. Special education can be a wonderful place for kids who have mental health issues because they get specialized care, a specialized education plan. So it can be great when it's needed, but when it's not needed, it can become a stigma. It can cause a child to think that he or she is not an intelligent child. I mean, it can be bad. If it's needed, yes. But in many, many, many cases, it's not needed. They just put those kids there to get rid of them. I'm talking about black kids in particular. So Dr. Burke says, students should never be denied access to special education services because of their race or ethnicity. But this is happening in school districts across the country thanks to the Obama administration's equity in IDEA regulation. That is such crap. The Obama administration's focus on being equitable, his encouragement of schools to seek equity in schools is not the reason why black kids are being placed in special education. His suggested equity programs were put in place to prevent the disproportionate placement of black kids in special education or suspended and expelled. It's just like these people to twist a thing, to pervert a thing. This was not the intent of the regulation, but it is an inevitable byproduct of its flawed assumptions. Well, at least she acknowledged that that was not the intent, but I strongly disagree with her that that's even the byproduct. The Obama administration looked at the racial statistics on special education, as I have and outlined in my book, and made two assumptions: that African American students were disproportionately overrepresented. That's not an assumption, that is a fact. And that this overrepresentation constituted a harm that required federal pressure to ameliorate. He was right on both fronts. He was right that African American students were overrepresented in special education and that this was a harm to them because some didn't need to be there, as I just explained. So this is another area of public education where racism, systemic racism, has a horrible, hateful impact on black students. And what the Obama administration did to try to address it, she's demonizing it. What the Biden-Harris administration is doing to try to address it, they will gut that as well. School districts deemed to overrepresent minority students in special education assignment or in discipline amongst special education students are tagged by their state education agencies as engaging in significant disproportionality. It is true. And are required to reallocate 15% of their IDEA Part B money into coordinated early intervening services that are intended to address the root causes of disproportionality. In practice, this can mean raiding special education funding to pay for CRT-inspired equity consultants and professional development. All junk, what she just said. Page 336 of this manual. All junk. That ain't taking money away from special education program. And even if it does take some money from special education program, it is needed to try to keep African American students out of special education if they don't need it. Because again, there's the stigma of that. And secondly, they're in there taking spots that kids who really need special education could have. But again, they're going to twist it. They're going to try to pervert it. This is especially problematic given that both of the assumptions behind equity in IDEA are flawed. They're not. Special education services provide extra assistance to students. They do not harm them. And according to the most rigorous research on the subject, conducted by Penn State's Paul Morgan, Black students are actually underrepresented in special education once adequate statistical controls are made. That means that this regulation effectively further depresses the provision of valuable services to an already underserved group. Bull. I did the research. I put it in my book. The Obama administration certainly did the research and took actions upon it as well. What she just said is total malarkey. Black kids are overrepresented in special education, and many of them should not be there. If they need to be there, it is a wonderful plan, a wonderful program, and can help kids. But if they don't need to be there, given the impression that we have a disproportionate percentage of kids, Black kids, that have mental health issues, that's not true. That's not factual. It is the way these kids are often identified and placed into these programs. So yeah, if Black kids need to be in special education, it is a wonderful plan, as I just said. But if not, we need to keep them out of there. Where we really need them is in gifted education. Because in gifted education, they're going to be challenged to do their best, to go home and study, to focus on academic excellence. So that's one of the little secrets, little tips that I want to share with you. Get your kids in AP classes. All right, that's where you want them. Okay? So those are some of the policies that Project 2025 intends to implement if Trump is reelected. So many times we get distracted with all of Trump's foolishness. He's a master at getting us off. Again, talking about Kamala Harris's race. That's just a distraction to take our focus away from the policies that these people will implement if he is reelected. Let's stay focused. Let's stay focused on policies, not personalities and distractions. Policies. And the policies of Project 2025 are horrible across the board for Black Americans. And what I just showed you are the education policies that they intend to implement if Trump is reelected. How do we keep them from doing that? By voting, and voting specifically for Kamala Harris. Whatever issues you got with her, put them to the side. Right now, this is about protecting our democracy and defending civil rights. All right, I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. This is the content we bring you on a weekly basis. I appreciate you listening to this video from start to finish, and I trust that it has opened your eyes on some things. Thank you, and until the next time, peace.